In just 56 seconds, a young African soldier turned a Supreme Court justice's public humiliation into one of the most shocking courtroom reversals in American history. Why did Clarence Thomas try to silence Ibrahim Traoré on live TV? And what truth was he so afraid of? It was 6:04 a.m. in Washington, D.C., and the city had not yet stirred. The streets outside the Supreme Court stood solemn and shadowed in morning fog, but within a stately Georgian townhouse tucked behind a wrought iron gate in Fairfax, Virginia. Justice Clarence Thomas was already awake. He didn't need an alarm. Men like him never did. Dressed in an old Marine t-shirt, his footsteps echoed softly across the marble kitchen floor as he poured himself a cup of black coffee, no cream, no sugar, no distractions. The silence was his favorite companion. Not the kind of silence that meant absence, but the kind that roared with control. Outside, America believed Clarence Thomas to be just a judge, a conservative icon, sure, but nothing more than one voice among 9 on the highest court in the land. But what most didn't know, and perhaps weren't meant to know, was that Clarence Thomas had long ago stopped being just a justice. He had become something else, something far more dangerous. He was a guardian of an old order, a relic not of justice, but of design, part of an elite machine whose gears ground quietly behind the curtain of American democracy. By 7:00 a.m., he had already reviewed 2 reports, one from a think tank in Arlington, warning of unstable populist leadership in West Africa, and another from a private security firm outlining shifts in mining contracts in Burkina Faso. Neither document had anything to do with law, and yet he read them like scripture. Traoré. He muttered the name under his breath like a curse. The name had been appearing more frequently lately. Too frequently. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, young, defiant, military-educated, and unapologetically African. He had seized power in a bloodless coup in Burkina Faso just a year earlier. But it wasn't the coup that unsettled Thomas, it was the rhetoric. Traoré spoke with the fire of a Malcolm X and the vision of a Sankara. Worse, he was organizing rallying youth, challenging IMF contracts, expelling Western military bases. He was dangerous, not to America, to the idea of America, to the architecture Clarence Thomas had spent his career quietly helping to maintain. By 8:00 a.m., Thomas was in his office, the large mahogany desk, spotless except for a thick leather dossier marked Foreign Judicial Targets, 2025. The room was dim-lit only by the gray morning light through long curtains. He liked it that way. He believed a man in darkness could see more clearly what others feared to look at. He picked up his phone, dialed a number. No name, no greeting. Send me the NGO list with West Africa exposure. And get the Manhattan Group on standby. He hung up without waiting for acknowledgement. To the outside world, Clarence Thomas was a man of few words, an aging originalist justice known for his silence during oral arguments. But silence in his world was a tool. It disarmed enemies. It invited underestimation. In private, his reach extended far beyond the courtroom. Corporate boards, ultra-conservative legal societies, black budget intelligence, think tanks, he was a quiet architect among the shadows of empire. Through these networks, Thomas had helped bury political uprisings, discredit foreign activists, and rewrite the story of who the enemy was. And now it was Ibrahim Traoré. The problem wasn't just that Traoré had kicked out the French military or taken back gold mines. It was what he represented, a generation of African leaders who no longer saw the West as a mentor, but as a predator. That wasn't rebellion, that was infection, and infections must be contained. By mid-morning, Thomas was meeting in a private room above a law firm near K Street. The firm had no sign outside. Inside, it smelled faintly of pine and old money. Around the table were 4 men and 1 woman, none of whom held public office, but each of whom could unseat one. A Silicon Valley investor, a former CIA Africa station chief, a defense contractor CEO, a political lobbyist, and a strategist from the Federalist Society. They weren't meeting to pass laws. They were meeting to design a correction. Traoré has captured the hearts of a demographic we've ignored for too long, the strategist said, flipping through slides. He speaks to youth. He speaks to sovereignty. He doesn't ask permission. Thomas didn't reply. He simply pointed to one line on the screen. Asset target judicial neutralization. A silence settled over the room, heavy and absolute. "You want to discredit him?" legally asked the lobbyist. "No," Thomas said finally. "I want him disqualified. Permanently." And with that, the gavel fell, though no courtroom heard it. Thousands stood in the dusty heat of Ouagadougou's central square, their chants rising like wildfire beneath a sweltering sky. Banners waved, fists clenched, voices boomed with a kind of unity that felt sacred. At the center of it all, standing atop an armored vehicle, was a man in military fatigues, not cloaked in medals or surrounded by guards, but alone, exposed, fearless. He raised one hand and the crowd hushed with the devotion only the truly disillusioned could give. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, age 34, a soldier by training, a revolutionary by consequence. He spoke not with the polished cadence of a Western-educated politician, but with the rhythm of the streets, the markets, the fields. His words crackled with conviction, raw and unapologetic. "We are not your colonies," he shouted in French, his voice soaring through the square. "We are not your chessboard. We are Burkina Faso, and our people will never bow again." The roar that followed could be heard across the city. Only 8 months earlier, the nation had been held hostage by a failing president, one propped up by foreign contracts, corporate interests, and silent men in gray suits. Corruption flowed through the government like a river of rot. Gold mines were leased to outsiders for pennies. Food insecurity rose while luxury cars lined the gates of ministries. The people begged for relief. They got silence. Until Traoré. He had been a mid-level officer in the army, brilliant, quiet, observant. But he had something few men in uniform possessed: vision. When he led the coup, it was done with clinical precision, 0 civilian casualties, no looting, no chaos. He seized power not with blood, but with order, positioning himself as the stabilizer, not a dictator. And the people, exhausted, betrayed, and angry, welcomed him with open arms. But it wasn't just what Traoré did that made him dangerous in the eyes of the West. It was what he refused to do. He expelled French military bases within 3 months of assuming power, stating flatly, "We will no longer house the ghosts of empires past." He suspended all foreign mining licenses pending review and ordered audits into the revenue trails of every Western-backed NGO operating in the country. Diplomats protested. Ambassadors begged for meetings. He denied them all. He didn't need their money. He needed justice. To the average Burkinabe youth, unemployed, skeptical, and long told they were powerless, Traoré became a symbol of resistance. TikToks and reels of his speeches went viral across Francophone Africa. He was dubbed the African Phoenix and Le Capitaine Rouge. Students in Dakar wore T-shirts with his face next to slogans like "Rise or be ruled." But to think tanks in Brussels and conference rooms in Washington, he was something far more terrifying, an idea that could spread. By early spring, intelligence reports began landing on the desks of European diplomats and American strategic advisors. They warned of a new wave, Mali, Guinea, Niger, all showing signs of youth-led military leadership, emboldened by Traoré's model. One report stated bluntly, if Traoré succeeds in restoring sovereignty without Western assistance, the neo-colonial framework in West Africa will begin to unravel. And then came the speech. Standing in front of a rusting French military outpost, as it was being dismantled brick by brick, Traoré addressed not just his nation, but the world. Cameras from Al Jazeera, RT, and Pan-African networks captured every word. "Africa is not your farm," he declared. "Our leaders have sold our soil, our people, and our dignity. But that era is over. From this moment forward, we decide what freedom means." Within hours, the clip was flagged by multiple Western agencies as rhetorically inflammatory. But it was too late. The fire had been lit. Somewhere in Virginia, Justice Clarence Thomas watched that clip in grim silence, his jaw tightening. He saw more than just a young rebel with a loud voice. He saw the future, and it was not American. The room had no windows. It smelled faintly of leather-filtered air and wood polish designed to evoke a sense of tradition, control, and timelessness. Hidden 2 levels beneath a historic office building off Constitution Avenue, the conference room was often referred to by its regulars as the Dome, though there was no actual dome overhead. The nickname was ironic, even smug, like the men who gathered there. At the head of the polished walnut table sat Justice Clarence Thomas, eyes impassive fingers steepled beneath his chin. Around him were five others, none elected, none accountable, yet all more powerful than most sitting senators. The quietest man in the room was a former NSA liaison, now attached to a private intelligence consortium. Beside him, a lobbyist who'd engineered half a dozen covert trade wins in sub-Saharan Africa. At the far end, a woman from a high-level legal foundation with deep roots in judicial training programs abroad. They had names, of course, but in this room, titles mattered more. On the screen before them flickered images of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, delivering speeches, greeting cheering crowds, shaking hands with foreign diplomats under the fluttering flag of Burkina Faso. His popularity curve was steep, and so was the threat it posed. He's not just a populist, the woman said, pointing at the screen. He's crafting a sovereign narrative. No Western dependencies, no foreign advisors, no development aid with fine print. That kind of language inspires more than just voters. It inspires defiance. The lobbyist leaned forward. We've seen this pattern before: Libya, Venezuela, even early Zimbabwe. When resource nationalization enters the conversation, things escalate. Fast. Thomas said nothing. His silence drew attention like a vacuum. When he finally spoke, it was calm, clipped but commanding. Legal framing, not military, not now. We maintain distance and optics. We're not orchestrating a coup. We're correcting a threat through legitimacy. A murmur of understanding rippled through the room. It wasn't about bullets, not yet. It was about narrative architecture undermining a figure by elevating a framework that could justify pressure. The soft kill. The intelligence liaison slid a folder across the table. Inside, financial audits of NGOs operating in Ouagadougou compiled dossiers of potential abuses by Traoré's security forces and early drafts of international human rights inquiries unsigned but prepped for delivery. It was a blueprint. All it needed was a spark. We start with discreditation, he said. Tie him to violations, press suppression, political imprisonments, any whispers of corruption, leak to media through secondary outlets, feed talking points to Western think tanks. Then the woman asked, then we introduce legal friction, UN oversight, ICC inquiries, visa bans, travel blocks, frozen assets, if necessary, coordinated regime pressure through diplomatic back channels. There was a pause, and then Thomas delivered the final phrase, dry definitive: judicial neutralization. On paper, it was an initiative for accountability. Behind closed doors, it was a doctrine of controlled collapse, a way to end a rising movement before it ever breached the fortress of Western control. The meeting adjourned in silence. Outside, the Capitol dome gleamed in the sun, bright, proud, and utterly unaware of the shadows stirring below it. Long before bullets are fired or borders are breached, there is a quieter war fought not in jungles or deserts, but in courtrooms, treaties, and press releases. It is a war of definitions and doctrines, where the weapon is the law and the battlefield is perception. In Washington's innermost circles, this strategy is known by many names: lawfare soft kill, legal neutralization, but Clarence Thomas preferred something more: clinical judicial isolation. He had studied it for years long before Traoré emerged on his radar. The tactic was as old as empires sharpened in the colonial twilight of the 20th century. In Latin America, indigenous leaders and leftist presidents were routinely indicted on corruption charges, some true, most exaggerated. Ecuador, Bolivia, Brazil. They were rarely assassinated in the traditional sense. Instead, they were discredited, tried by proxy, drowned in a sea of international law. By the time the truth surfaced, their movements were already gutted. Africa had seen similar cycles. In the Congo, Patrice Lumumba was first accused of communist ties before his actual assassination. In Kenya, judicial reviews clipped nationalist leaders long before riot police arrived. In the early 2000s, the ICC, funded largely by Western donors, targeted over a dozen African heads of state or generals while carefully ignoring American or European infractions. Justice, it seemed, wore a tailored mask. Thomas understood this dynamic better than most, and unlike his predecessors, he had access to something they never did: a new global network of civil society machinery disguised as humanitarian outreach. The key node was a DC-based NGO called Liberty Accord, a nonprofit in name, a geopolitical lever in practice. On the surface, it championed democratic reforms, judicial training, and election transparency in developing nations. It hosted international conferences, published sleek white papers, and trained foreign judges in the principles of Western jurisprudence. But beneath the logo and mission statement, it was funded by a complex web of donors, oil conglomerates, with stakes in African natural gas, agribusinesses eyeing rare farmland, and tech firms eager to pilot surveillance tech in less regulated environments. Liberty Accord was Thomas's quiet instrument. Though he had no official title, he had long served as a guiding hand, using its networks to promote allies, screen threats, and when necessary, exert pressure. The organization had contacts in Burkina Faso, 2 embedded advisors within the Ministry of Justice, and a regional coordinator who had been compiling dirt on the military government for months. The beauty of the model was its deniability. Liberty Accord would never accuse anyone directly. Instead, it funded local partners to issue independent reports outlining supposed abuses. These reports would be cited by Western journalists and think tanks who would amplify the narrative. Eventually, this chorus would find its way to the ears of the UN, the EU, and the ICC. When pressure peaked, sanctions followed, or indictments, or asset freezes. One didn't need to assassinate a leader. One simply made them untenable. The plan for Traoré was already in motion. The first case brief had already been outlined: allegations of journalist harassment, intimidation of political rivals, and misuse of military tribunals. The evidence was circumstantial at best, but perception, especially in the global north, was more powerful than proof. Thomas's allies were finalizing talking points. Draft op-eds had already been prepared for release in The Atlantic and Foreign Policy. The phrase "dangerous populist with authoritarian tendencies" appeared in nearly every paragraph. What made Traoré especially vulnerable was that he played outside the system and thus had no allies within it. He didn't attend Davos. He wasn't backed by the IMF. He didn't dine at diplomatic receptions or golf with French envoys. He was a soldier, a young one, passionate, unpolished, and alone in the halls of international law. And that, to Thomas, made him the perfect target. In another room far from the court, the Oval Office or public oversight, Thomas reviewed a document labeled Preliminary Legal Actions Burkina Faso. He read the footnotes, smiled at the carefully worded ambiguities, and made a single note in the margin: plausible deniability ensured. Move forward. Outside, the city buzzed with the rhythm of democracy, hearings, protests, press conferences. But in the shadows, a different kind of justice was being written, one that needed no jury, no evidence, and no consent. Only a signature. The document bore the insignia of legitimacy, neatly stamped logos of the International Criminal Court, the European External Action Service, and a joint advisory body from the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. It looked official. It read objective. But beneath the diplomatic language was the edge of a blade. The preliminary arrest warrant for Captain Ibrahim Traoré cited a pattern of systemic human rights abuses, including documented cases of press suppression, unlawful detainment of political opponents, and evidence suggesting extrajudicial military actions against suspected insurgents. Every claim was vague enough to be debated, yet framed in a way that made rebuttal look like denial. The charges were spearheaded not by one government, but by a coalition of 5 Western-aligned nations, each claiming concern, none admitting orchestration. On paper, it was a multilateral response to regional instability. In reality, it was the opening shot in a geopolitical decapitation. The warrant hadn't yet been made public, but leaks were intentional and well-timed. Within hours, prominent Western news outlets began rolling out special investigations into Traoré's government. CNN International aired a segment titled Burkina Faso's Rising Strongman, complete with grainy footage of soldiers detaining young men in dusty villages. MSNBC ran a roundtable featuring analysts who questioned the alarming militarization of youth movements under Traoré. Even The Guardian, typically cautious, published an op-ed warning that West Africa may be witnessing the rise of a new authoritarian populism. The media storm wasn't spontaneous. It had been choreographed, seeded weeks in advance by Liberty Accord operatives feeding sanitized dossiers to select journalists. Each story shared similar phrasing, often citing independent sources or regional analysts, though few had ever set foot in Ouagadougou. The tactic wasn't to prove guilt. It was to implant doubt enough to erode public support, especially among Africa's fragile middle class in the diaspora abroad. Traoré noticed the shift almost immediately. He wasn't naive. He had long suspected a campaign was brewing, but the sudden synchronization of headlines, interviews, and policy briefings sent a clear message the Western establishment had drawn its line. What disturbed him wasn't the propaganda, it was the tempo. Too fast, too aligned, too confident. Late one night, as he reviewed the latest foreign press clippings, a soft knock came at his door. His intelligence advisor entered, eyes heavy, voice low. He placed a flash drive on the table. "This came from New York," he said. "Internal UN correspondence. Classified. Someone inside is trying to help." The files were encrypted. Traoré opened them in silence. Contained within were internal UN memos, emails between legal advisors, and preliminary drafts of press statements prepared in the anticipation of the warrant's release. One message in particular stood out. It was from a UN liaison assigned to West Africa, one of the few African-born diplomats stationed in Geneva. The message was short: "You are being framed. The ICC knows this is political, but pressure is coming from Washington. There's a term circulating among legal observers, judicial strike doctrine. They say you're the first test case." Traoré read the line again. And again. Judicial strike doctrine. The phrase chilled him. It was deliberate, cold, methodical. He could almost hear the gavel dropping, the narrative crystallizing in glossy think tank reports, in diplomatic briefings, in newspaper columns written by men who had never seen the fields of Bobo Dioulasso, or the despair in the eyes of young Burkinabés who had been promised so much yet given so little. His voice was calm, but something dark simmered beneath. "They don't fear me," he said quietly to his advisor. "They fear the possibility that I might succeed." Outside the presidential compound, the streets of Ouagadougou were still, but something had shifted. The air carried a weight. Traoré stood at the window watching headlights of a lone car pass through the dark. He understood now the battlefield had moved. It was no longer political, it was judicial. A war not of arms but of arguments, narratives, and legal ambushes designed to strangle sovereignty behind the mask of global order. The trap was set, but Traoré was no ordinary prey. The message came through just after 2:18 a.m., routed through a scrambled channel via Bamako, then bounced through servers in Istanbul, Rabat, and Pretoria before landing on a secured terminal inside the Presidential Intelligence Wing in Ouagadougou. It was tagged Priority Red, and though it appeared like routine chatter, the embedded cipher was unmistakable. Traoré's chief of internal intelligence, a wiry man known only as Koulibaly, was already awake. He had long given up the luxury of sleep. The moment the alert pinged, he was at his desk decrypting it manually, a protocol reserved only for information deemed existential. The transmission originated from a contact deep within the United Nations Legal Affairs Division, a sympathetic analyst who had grown increasingly disturbed by what she described as a procedural bypass of alarming proportions. The language in her communiqué was sparse, careful, but what it lacked in volume it made up for in consequence. Operation phrases decoded include judicial strike, Burkina Falls, soft kill authorization possible under diplomatic cover. Koulibaly read it 3 times before breathing. These were not just bureaucratic euphemisms. These were code phrases, language used by covert legal operational teams, often aligned with intelligence agencies. Judicial strike referred to a framework in which sovereign leaders were isolated through coordinated legal, financial, and diplomatic pressure under the pretense of multilateral justice. Burkina Falls was likely a project name, an outcome code name denoting regime change. But the worst was soft kill authorization. In operational slang, that meant the target Traoré was no longer seen as a political problem, but a removable obstacle. Koulibaly didn't hesitate. He grabbed the secure sat phone, bypassed layers of protocol, and called the only man with the authority to break every rule at once. Traoré answered on the first ring. His voice was steady but lower than usual. "Talk." Koulibaly didn't soften the blow. "They're preparing something far worse than a legal case. You're not being prosecuted. You're being erased, cold, invisible. The plan is already in motion." There was a beat of silence. Then Traoré exhaled. Not in fear, in clarity. "Get everyone in the situation room," he said. "Now." Midnight session, full security lockdown, no external signals, use analog backups. Within the hour, the compound buzzed with movement. Ministers arrived in armored convoys. Guards doubled at every entrance. Lights flickered on in war rooms buried 2 levels below the palace gardens. The young president, dressed in plain fatigues, stepped into the center of a long oak table. His eyes scanned the room. No script, no speeches. Just the raw pulse of a man now fully aware that he had become a target of the most powerful machine on earth. He tapped the table once and began. "We thought we were in a political fight," he said, his voice like iron. "We were wrong. We are in a war for our very existence." By dawn, every member of Traoré's inner circle had seen the intercepted communication. The room had gone quiet after Koulibaly presented the findings. No one said it aloud, but the truth hovered heavy in the air. The president of Burkina Faso was now an active target of a global takedown operation. Fleeing might have been the safest option. Other leaders had done it, vanished quietly into exile, avoiding the weight of international tribunals or sudden accidents disguised as natural deaths. But Ibrahim Traoré was not that kind of man. He had climbed too far, seen too much, and carried the voices of too many who would never have the privilege of escape. He leaned over the long table, palms flat, eyes unwavering. "If we run, they'll write our story. If we speak, we write it ourselves." That same morning, under a veil of digital anonymity and counter-surveillance encryption, a controlled leak was released to 3 major Pan-African media outlets: Jeune Afrique, Afrique Media, and Sahara Reporters. It contained redacted excerpts of the intercepted UN communications, scrubbed of sources but powerful enough to provoke alarm. The headlines followed swiftly: Burkina Faso president targeted by Western judicial operation, leaked UN memos reveal covert plan to remove Traoré judicial strike doctrine, exposed Africa's leadership under attack. The effect was instantaneous. WhatsApp chains buzzed in Dakar. Telegram groups in Mali lit up. Twitter threads from journalists in Niger, Chad, and Cameroon dissected the memos line by line. TikTok creators translated the leak into local dialects. The story spread like brush fire. And then came the speech. No podium, no flags, just Traoré standing in an open field surrounded by young cadets in olive fatigues and farmers in dusty tunics with a single camera broadcasting live across West Africa. His voice rang with the fury of generations. They will not come with tanks or planes. They come with courts and cameras. They do not shout. They whisper in corridors, cloaked in suits and sealed folders. But make no mistake, this is colonization in a new uniform. A gavel, not a gun. A warrant, not a bullet. They call it justice, but it is conquest. He never mentioned names. He didn't have to. They fear the sound of African feet marching without their permission. They fear our youth thinking for themselves. They fear what we could build if we stopped asking for their validation. And so they offer us shackles disguised as treaties, chains that rattle in courtrooms. But we see them now. The masks are off. We will not kneel, not to threats, not to empires, not to silence. It was not just a speech. It was a spark. By midnight, the hashtags Cherchan Judicial Strike and Chanchi Traoré Speaks trended across the continent. In Mali, thousands marched through the streets waving Pan-African flags. In Niger, students staged sit-ins at French cultural centers. Even in Paris, young African descendant activists rallied in the Latin Quarter, holding up signs that read, "Justice" or "Justus Traoré" had done what no intelligence file had predicted. He had taken the weapon meant to isolate him, the law, and turned it inside out. He made it visible, tangible, contemptible. Suddenly, the narrative was no longer a courtroom drama orchestrated by powerful men in dark suits. It was a movement. Inside the Liberty Accord headquarters in D.C., screens flickered with coverage they could not control. Analysts scrambled to assess public sentiment. Think tank briefings were hastily rewritten. One staffer whispered what many feared to admit aloud: "We may have underestimated his reach." Clarence Thomas watched in silence, lips drawn, tight fingers steepled as before. But this time the silence was not strategy. It was irritation. The boy was supposed to fold, not ignite a continent. But it was too late. Africa was listening. The leak hit Washington like an unexpected tremor, subtle at first but growing with a silent intensity that rippled through corridors of influence. By the time the story made its way onto NPR and Al Jazeera English, the phrases judicial strike and soft kill protocol were no longer whispers in encrypted documents, they were public currency. And in a town where power lives and dies by plausible deniability, Clarence Thomas was suddenly far too visible. Inside the Supreme Court's marbled halls, the mood had shifted. Justices don't speak of politics, not publicly, and rarely even in chambers. But the air had grown colder around Thomas. His younger colleagues, particularly Justices Kavanaugh and Barrett, began glancing at him during conference with something that hovered between curiosity and caution. At a private lunch reserved for clerks and interns, an offhand comment from a staffer made its way back up the chain. "Is it true Justice Thomas is running a shadow foreign policy from his basement?" The line was meant as a joke, but no one laughed. Not really. Because behind closed doors, more than one justice had already begun to wonder the same. The judicial branch is built on silence, on distance from the mud of politics. But now Thomas was being named on protest signs in Paris and Johannesburg. Hashtags pairing his name with imperialism and authoritarianism were trending. International human rights lawyers were quoting excerpts of the leaked memos, tying them to Liberty Accord and calling for congressional oversight. A handful of former State Department officials had gone on record suggesting that rogue judicial influence and foreign destabilization should not be ignored. What unnerved Thomas most was not the criticism. It was the fact that some of it came from inside the machine. In a secured briefing room in Arlington, his inner circle had gathered. The usual confidence in their voices had faded. Across the table, his media advisor, a former speechwriter for a vice president, was visibly sweating. "You wanted him destabilized. Fine. But now we've got editorials in The Atlantic and Le Monde calling Traoré a modern-day Mandela. And the data's ugly. He's got the support of 300 million youth across West Africa, and now he's starting to influence the diaspora in Europe and even here. New York, LA, Houston African communities are organizing." Thomas sipped water, his expression unreadable. "The boy's more than a symbol," now the advisor continued. "He's a cause. And with this leak, he's winning the narrative war." At the far end of the table, an older intelligence contact sat quietly until now. Then, without lifting his gaze, he said in a gravel voice, "He's not a child. He's Che Guevara with satellites. And we just gave him a bullhorn." Silence fell. No one argued. Thomas stood slowly, walking toward the window where sunlight filtered through thin blinds. He watched as tourists walked past the Capitol dome, oblivious to the game being played beneath its shadow. He had underestimated the reach of the digital world. The old model of neutralization, discredit, isolate, and if needed, remove was no longer clean. Not when a single video could mobilize an entire continent. Not when the target turned the narrative into a weapon. Not when the court of public opinion operated faster than any grand jury. And yet he refused to retreat. "Let them talk," he said calmly. "They're moved by emotion. I deal in reality." But even as he spoke, the cracks widened. A memo from the Judicial Ethics Oversight Committee had landed on the Chief Justice's desk, flagging concerns over extrajudicial entanglements and potential conflicts of interest relating to Liberty Accord. It wasn't an indictment, not yet, but it was a warning. The first Thomas had received in over 2 decades. That evening, his clerks noticed something peculiar. For the first time in years, Thomas lingered in his office long after sunset, not reading case law, but watching and rewatching a clip of Traoré's speech, the one about gavel and bullet, about masks and conquest. Each time, Thomas's jaw tightened slightly more. For the first time since the plan began, the judge who ruled in silence was now a man surrounded by noise, and it was growing louder by the hour. 3 days after Traoré's speech set the continent alight, the political aftershocks began to take form, not in words this time, but in signatures. In Bamako, Conakry, and Algiers, presidential seals were pressed to parchment as Mali, Guinea, and Algeria signed a joint declaration of solidarity with Burkina Faso, condemning what they called foreign-engineered judicial aggression against sovereign leadership. The language was measured, but the message was not. Africa is no longer a field for experiments in neocolonial legality, the declaration read. The targeting of leaders who reject external dictates is a threat to every independent nation. We stand with Burkina Faso. For decades, African diplomacy had tiptoed through Western interests, careful not to bite the hands that controlled aid trade and policy leverage. But the leak had shattered the unspoken rulebook. What began as outrage was rapidly evolving into coordinated resistance. In Niamey and Freetown, parliaments debated legislation to ban NGOs linked to Liberty Accord and its affiliates. Within a week, 4 nations revoked the operational licenses of more than a dozen foreign-backed civil society organizations, each flagged for undue political influence. In a cry, protesters surrounded a Liberty Accord field office chanting, "No justice in your justice." The wave did not stop there. At the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, a rare emergency session was called. Delegates from 46 member states gathered in private chambers, the leaked UN documents laid out before them in black and white. Even leaders typically cautious about continental unity found themselves unsettled. If Traoré could be targeted, so could they. The tools were invisible, but the damage was real. Reputations, dismantled by reports leadership threatened, not with tanks but with tribunals. The AU's final communiqué was uncharacteristically blunt. "We condemn any extrajudicial manipulation of international legal frameworks to serve geopolitical ends. Africa's sovereignty is not negotiable. We urge the International Criminal Court and the governments of the United States and its allies to respect the dignity and autonomy of African governance." In D.C., the message landed with a dull thud, hard to ignore, harder to counter. Inside, Liberty Accord inboxes flooded with revocation notices, canceled visas, and legal challenges from local governments. Project coordinators scrambled to vacate offices before their equipment was seized. Funding from private donors began to stall as corporate backers questioned the optics. And behind the scenes, murmurs spread in conservative legal circles had Thomas overreached. But in Ouagadougou, the mood was different. There was no celebration, not yet. But the fog of isolation had lifted. For the first time since the campaign against him had begun, Traoré was no longer standing alone. He had triggered more than outrage. He had activated memory, the memory of Lumumba, Sankara, and Nkrumah. And this time the story wasn't ending in silence. This time Africa was answering back. In a nondescript conference room inside the Europol headquarters in The Hague, 3 diplomats from the U.S. State Department, 2 European Union legal envoys, and 1 quietly watchful liaison from the International Criminal Court sat around a narrow glass table. The curtains were drawn, phones were off. Names were never spoken out loud. The file on the table was marked Burkina Faso, Traoré Warsaw, Case 4887 P, Preliminary Investigation. It was the beginning of a gambit, one that would either neutralize a rising symbol of African independence or permanently expose the soft underbelly of Western legal diplomacy. The ICC had been used before subtly, surgically, but this time it was different. This time the pressure didn't come from a vague coalition of concerned NGOs. It came directly from Washington, and not just any part of Washington, it came from the bench. Justice Clarence Thomas had grown impatient. The African response to the leaked documents had been louder, faster, and more coordinated than his inner circle had predicted. What was meant to be a quiet discreditation had exploded into a continental awakening. His reputation, once untouchable, had begun to gather whispers inside the court, across the media, and even among his oldest allies. He needed to regain control. And to do that, he needed a verdict not in law but in narrative. The ICC offered the perfect theater. It had global reach, symbolic authority, and despite its flaws, a reputation that remained intact enough to serve its purpose. If Traoré could be formally indicted even pre-trial, the headlines alone would accomplish what Thomas's media operatives had failed to engineer. Indicted war criminal had a sting that no speech or solidarity march could soften. And so Thomas made the call. Not directly, of course. Not from chambers or federal phones, but through backdoor lines, old friends from transatlantic judicial conferences, private communications with think tank liaisons in Brussels, and a quiet academic exchange dinner with 2 Dutch legal scholars closely connected to The Hague's prosecutorial office. The message was consistent. The time to act is now. He is destabilizing the region. African unrest is rising. The legal system must step in not to punish, but to preserve order. For all its performance of neutrality, the ICC had long been susceptible to geopolitical nudging. Prosecutorial priorities often shifted based on donor state pressure, and the U.S., though not a formal member, still carried weight through informal funding, routes, and diplomatic entanglements. Within days, the tone inside the court shifted. The preliminary investigation against Traoré, which had been shelved for lack of credible evidence, was suddenly reopened. An internal memo from the ICC's Office of the Prosecutor now listed Burkina Faso under its active review list. Meanwhile, Thomas took an uncharacteristically public step. In a closed-door lecture at the University of Amsterdam, technically part of a judicial diplomacy tour, he made pointed remarks about the dangers of revolutionary populism dressed in the garments of liberation and warned of military rulers leveraging emotional rhetoric to escape accountability. He never said Traoré's name. He didn't have to. The quote was on Politico Europe the next morning, on Reuters by noon, on Fox News by sundown. In that moment, Clarence Thomas stopped being the shadow. He had stepped fully into the spotlight, not just as a justice, but as a prosecutor of vision, a man defending order and international norms against what his inner circle now called the wildfire of rogue sovereignty. Inside Liberty Accord's newly downsized operations room, advisors watched the ICC's public docket refresh. The Burkina Faso file now had a case officer. The press would pick it up within days. The machinery was moving again. But something had changed. By leading the charge, Thomas had abandoned the shield of distance. He had transformed from orchestrator to symbol. If this worked, he'd restore his dominance. If it failed, if the indictment was rejected, if the African bloc retaliated further, he would become the villain in a story no longer written by his hand. And far away in Ouagadougou, Captain Traoré watched the coverage in silence. His eyes were calm, but his grip on the edge of the table was unflinching. "They've chosen the theater," he said softly to Coulibaly. "Then let's give them a performance they won't forget." The indictment wasn't official yet, but the rumors were enough to poison the atmosphere. Every news cycle tightened the noose, every expert panel raised the question louder. Should Ibrahim Traoré face trial at The Hague? The phrase began to echo like a prophecy. In courtrooms, coffee shops, and classrooms, from Dakar to Detroit, it became a symbol of something deeper: who controls the meaning of justice. Traoré understood better than most that winning in the courtroom meant little if you lost in the court of public opinion. So he moved first, not with soldiers, but with scholars. In a brightly lit hall in Ouagadougou, a round table convened unlike any before it. Traoré's staff brought in African legal historians, civil rights attorneys from South Africa, professors of international law from Ethiopia, Ghana, and Nigeria, and a surprising addition, 2 retired U.S. constitutional scholars who had broken ties with their former institutions after the 2020 protests. One had even clerked for the U.S. Supreme Court years before Thomas's rise. The task was clear. Traoré didn't want defenders. He wanted witnesses' voices with credibility across hemispheres who could dissect the mechanisms of lawfare, name the actors, explain the pattern. One elder professor from Senegal described it perfectly. They dress the bullet in robes. Then they call it justice. Within a week, Traoré's media team, with the help of a guerrilla documentary crew from Nairobi and 2 independent editors from New York, produced a documentary that would rewrite the rules of counter-propaganda. Its title was provocative, almost poetic, Robe and Bullet, the Modern Coup. In just under 26 minutes, it mapped the evolution of foreign interference from military coups to what one narrator called institutional warfare. It laid bare the connections between Clarence Thomas' Liberty Accord and the ghost network of foreign-backed NGOs quietly embedded across Africa. It featured UN documents, leaked legal memos, and testimonials from international legal experts who denounced the ICC's selective priorities. But what made the documentary go viral wasn't just the facts. It was the faces. Farmers from Burkina Faso, students from Ghana, a single mother in Bamako holding her child and saying, "Why must we always defend ourselves just for wanting to govern ourselves?" The documentary hit YouTube, Twitter, and African satellite channels simultaneously. Within 48 hours, it had 12 million views, trending in Lagos, London, Johannesburg, and Atlanta. Translations appeared in 11 languages. Activist accounts in France and the US shared it with captions like, "When justice becomes colonization. A gavel can be more dangerous than a gun." And then the unexpected happened. On college campuses across Europe and North America, students began protesting not against Traoré, but against Thomas. At Columbia University, students unfurled a massive banner reading "No trials without truth. Thomas, nur lawfare." In Berlin, young activists marched outside the American consulate holding posters of Traoré captioned, If Mandela stood trial today, would Thomas write the charges? Even a handful of African-American clergy and civil rights veterans' names once aligned with the old guard issued an open letter to the ICC and the U.S. Supreme Court. We know legal assassination when we see it. From Marcus Garvey to Fred Hampton to Patrice Lumumba, when voices rise for the oppressed, they are always labeled dangerous. This time we say no. Inside Liberty Accord, the mood soured. Donor meetings were canceled. European partners pulled back. One executive board member quietly resigned. And in Washington, Clarence Thomas saw the writing on the wall, not in legislation or judgments, but in headlines and hashtags. His silence was no longer seen as gravitas. It was read as guilt. The narrative had shifted. For the first time, the public no longer saw a reckless young soldier defying the world. They saw a young African leader surviving it, standing not just for a country, but for a continent tired of being lectured, judged, and condemned by foreign hands in silk gloves. Traoré hadn't escaped the legal trap. He had flipped it and made the world ask why it was said at all. The room was small wood-paneled and cold with artificial light. Inside, behind a door marked Restricted, Judiciary Committee Internal Review Justice. Clarence Thomas sat stone-faced across from a panel of 5 senators and 2 legal ethics officers. No cameras, no transcripts, only whispered tension and the dull scratching of pens. The summons hadn't been public, but it was historic. A sitting U.S. Supreme Court justice called to answer for potential extrajudicial misconduct and conflicts of interest tied to an international destabilization effort. The accusation was simple but deadly collusion with a foreign-focused NGO Liberty Accord while maintaining judicial neutrality in public. Senator Carla Rios, the ranking ethics chair, cleared her throat and read the opening statement with no emotion. Justice Thomas, we are in possession of internal communications, donor memos, and operative transcripts suggesting your role in orchestrating what appears to be an undeclared legal intervention against a foreign head of state. Thomas didn't blink. That's absurd. But the evidence was no longer a rumor. 2 nights prior, an anonymous whistleblower, once Liberty Accord's strategic operations coordinator, had come forward with encrypted recordings, internal Slack logs, and donor roundtable clips. In one recording, a voice identified as Thomas's calmly stated, "We don't need a coup. We need a case file strong enough to carry the illusion of law." The audio had been authenticated by 2 independent labs. Its contents sent shockwaves through Capitol Hill. The story broke on every major network within hours. Justice or Weapon headlined The Washington Post. MSNBC ran a full segment under Thomas and the gavel that crossed borders. Even traditionally conservative outlets began distancing themselves. On Fox News, one analyst asked, "What happens when the robe stops protecting the Constitution and starts protecting corporate interest abroad?" At Liberty Accord's now diminished headquarters, agents shredded documents and erased hard drives. A subpoena was already en route. Donor confidence collapsed overnight. Board members scrambled for statements of plausible distance. One even leaked an internal resignation letter accusing Thomas of gross overreach and ethical betrayal of the court. Public sentiment turned fast and hard. Protesters gathered outside the Supreme Court steps, holding signs that read, "The bench is not a battlefield and impeach imperial justice." Civil liberties groups drafted open letters. Legal ethicists, long silent, began demanding full transparency into all judicial affiliations with private organizations. Inside the hearing, Thomas held his line. "I advised as a private citizen, I have every right to speak on matters of international law." But the senators weren't convinced. The mood was no longer reverent. It was surgical. As Thomas left through a private exit escorted by 2 marshals, the cameras outside caught only a glimpse, his head down, the collar of his coat pulled tight. The man who once ruled in silence had now become the story he tried to write. And it was just beginning. The hearing chamber was packed to capacity. Spectators, staffers, journalists, and a restless public crammed into the rows of the U.S. Senate Committee on Governmental Affairs. The cameras were live. The microphones were hot. And for the first time in modern history, the name of a sitting Supreme Court justice was etched atop a session marked for national security review. C-SPAN's Chiron read simply, "Judiciary Ethics Hearing, Clarence Thomas, International Allegations," at precisely 9:00 a.m. 9. Chairwoman Rios opened with a voice more grave than grand. "We are not gathered here today to question jurisprudence," she said. "We are here because the sacred trust of impartiality has been potentially weaponized not just against our citizens, but against a foreign sovereign state. If proven true, this is not just a breach of ethics. It is a rupture of constitutional faith." Then, without ceremony, the first clip played. The video was grainy, pulled from internal Liberty Accord surveillance timestamped 6 months prior. In it, Thomas sat in a private strategy meeting. No robes, no courtrooms, only calculation. The audio was clear. "We won't use a bullet. We'll use a doctrine. Judicial strike, clean, clinical, irreversible. He won't know what hit him." Gasps broke across the room. Some senators whispered in disbelief. Others sat stunned. The phrase judicial strike was no longer rumor. It was real, and it carried the weight of conspiracy. Within minutes, the full memo leaked online. Titled "Framework for Legal Containment of Non-Compliant Foreign Leadership," the document outlined steps for undermining hostile leaders through legal instruments, media coordination, NGO leverage, and international court pressure. The language was technical, but the intention was unmistakable: to destabilize governments through judicial warfare. The reaction was swift and volcanic. Cable news erupted. CNN ran the headline, "Justice or Saboteur? The Clarence Thomas Files." MSNBC aired the entire memo with expert analysis warning, "This changes how we define judicial neutrality forever." Even Fox News, after initial hesitation, began featuring conservative voices voicing concern. "This isn't originalism," one said on air. "This is imperialism." American citizens watching from kitchen tables and phones responded with fury. Twitter hashtags trended in tandem. Aminasha Thomas resign, Chak robe and revolt, Shatasher not in our name. Petitions amassed millions of signatures within days. Calls flooded Senate offices. Protesters took to the streets not only in D.C., but in Chicago, Atlanta, Oakland, holding signs that read, "We don't destabilize democracy to defend it. No justice above the law." On Capitol Hill, the partisan lines began to blur. Senator Mark Talbot, a centrist Republican from Pennsylvania, shocked his party when he addressed reporters, "I defended Clarence Thomas for decades. I can't defend this." Weaponizing the judiciary for foreign interference is not conservatism, it's corruption. From the White House, the response was equally unambiguous. The president issued a formal statement. "The rule of law depends on public trust. If those appointed to protect our Constitution instead subvert it for international agendas, we must act." This is not about ideology. It's about accountability. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Law professors drafted impeachment templates. Former clerks wrote op-eds in the New York Times, confessing concerns they had silenced for years. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court issued a rare public comment, calling the allegations deeply troubling and worthy of urgent scrutiny. Inside Thomas's chambers, the atmosphere turned glacial. Staffers whispered in corners. Legal aides quietly updated their resumes. Outside, news helicopters circled above like vultures sensing dissent. Thomas himself remained silent, issuing no statement, granting no interview. He was still a justice, but no longer untouchable. His name, once uttered in tones of reverence or fear, now stood in headlines beside the words resignation, investigation, and betrayal. For a man who built his legacy on stoic silence, the roar of the nation had become impossible to ignore. The robe was no longer armor. It was evidence. The stage was unadorned. A single podium beneath a rust-colored cloth, framed by the green-gold-red banner of Burkina Faso. No flashing lights. No government insignia. Just a camera broadcasting live across 4 continents with simultaneous translations in English, French, Arabic, and Swahili. The feed streamed on YouTube, Pan-African TV, Al Jazeera, and unprecedentedly on a newly syndicated U.S. public network, its anchor saying solemnly, "And now a message from President Ibrahim Traoré to the people of America and the youth of Africa." Across the world, millions tuned in. When he stepped into frame, Traoré wore his military fatigues, but no beret, no medals. Only conviction. His face was calm, but there was fire in his eyes, a measured, restrained defiance paired with something deeper, grief turned into purpose. He began in English, his accent unmistakable but deliberate. Every word landed like a stone dropped in still water. "To the people of the United States." I come not as your enemy nor as your project. I come as a son of Africa, speaking truth to the children of liberty. There was no script, no teleprompter, only a man who knew the weight of history when it sat on your shoulders. I know that not every American believes in what has been done behind closed doors. I know many of you have fought your own battles against greed, disguised as policy against silence funded by power. I have read your books. I have studied your heroes. Then he paused, and I remember one voice whose words now echo across the ocean more than ever. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." The line hung in the air like incense. My country is not perfect. I am not perfect. But what we face now is not about perfection. It is about sovereignty. It is about the right of a people to choose their destiny without fear of sanctions of tribunals or of legal assassinations masked as accountability. He turned slightly, now facing a secondary camera, this one reserved for the African stream. To the youth of Africa, they call us impulsive. They call us unstable. But they fear us because we are no longer afraid. We are no longer asking for freedom. We are building it. We are no longer begging to be seen. We are making ourselves impossible to ignore. Applause erupted in auditoriums across Ouagadougou, Lagos, Addis Ababa, and Johannesburg. On social media, the speech was already being clipped, shared, subtitled, and quoted. In Harlem, a community center hosted a viewing party, elders and students watching side by side. In Paris, diaspora activists wiped tears as Traoré's voice carried across the Atlantic like a long-awaited echo. Then he returned his gaze to the main lens, the one beaming directly into America's living rooms. You were once revolutionaries. You dumped tea into harbors. You wrote declarations with trembling hands and fierce hearts. You knew what it meant to rise against empires. And now some among you have forgotten that feeling. But others, you remember. I see it in your protests. I read it in your poems. I feel it in the silence of those who dare not speak but still know the truth. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in solemn urgency. This is not just about Burkina Faso. It is not just about me. It is about the future we will either build together or destroy separately. If you believe in justice, then you must believe it applies to all people, not just those who can afford it, not just those who can enforce it. He ended with a whisper that felt louder than any shout. We are not your enemy, but we will no longer be your experiment. A beat of silence, and then the feed ended. The response was seismic. Within minutes, Twitter was flooded with hashtags, Korchash Traoré speaks, just injustice everywhere. The other MLK dream. In Los Angeles, a crowd of young organizers projected his speech onto the side of the courthouse downtown. At Howard University, students held a vigil, candles in hand, repeating the words, "You were once revolutionaries." Even in Washington, something shifted. A senator who had remained neutral throughout the Thomas hearings stood on the Capitol steps that night and said simply, "Maybe it's time we listen. Not judge, just listen." Traoré hadn't pleaded. He had invited, and millions had accepted. The letter was only one page long. Typed in Times New Roman, unsigned by staff, and absent of sentiment, it was delivered quietly to the Chief Justice's office at 6:47 a.m. on a rainy Thursday morning. No farewell press conference, no sweeping statement, just 12 terse lines ending with effective. Immediately, I resigned my position as Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Clarence Thomas had made his final ruling, and it was on himself. The decision had been inevitable. The pressure had become unbearable. Bipartisan demands from Congress, daily protests outside the court, opinion polls showing 78% of Americans favored resignation or impeachment. And beneath all the noise, a quieter force, a nation reckoning with what it meant when a judge stopped judging and started controlling. His last act as justice was not made in a courtroom, but in silence. Later that evening, long after the news had broken across every major outlet, Thomas stood alone in front of the statue of Lady Justice at the National Law Library. The room was empty, the air thick with the scent of old marble and polished brass. Rain tapped softly against the glass dome above. He didn't move for several minutes. She stood there, blindfolded, arms outstretched, sword in one hand, scales in the other. He had once believed in that image, had once thought that justice required firmness, discretion, control. But somewhere along the way, the line between guarding the law and shaping the world in its name had blurred. Where had it gone wrong? Was it in the first meeting with Liberty Accord? Or in the whispered phone call to The Hague? Or was it further back when the robe became armor and the gavel a hammer to strike rather than balance? He didn't cry, but something heavy settled behind his eyes as he stepped closer, gazing at the statue's blindfold, not as a symbol of fairness, but of how easily the powerful convince themselves they still serve justice while quietly tipping the scales. Outside the court, the news was already being absorbed, dissected, debated. Headlines read, "Thomas resigns amid scandal legacy in question. From justice to judgment, the fall of a supreme icon." But while the country debated his end, it also began a new beginning. The Senate Judiciary Committee announced a sweeping investigation into NGO overreach and foreign policy influence in judicial institutions. Draft legislation circulated proposing mandatory financial disclosures, restrictions on judges' affiliations with private entities, and the formation of an independent ethics tribunal for the U.S. judiciary. What began as a quiet operation cloaked in legitimacy had become a national reckoning, not just of one man's fall, but of the system that allowed it. Thomas turned his back on the statue and walked into the night, his figure swallowed by the shadows of a building he once ruled from, in silence. Lady Justice remained still blind to power, but never indifferent to truth. The red dust still blew through the streets of Ouagadougou, but something was different now. The air felt lighter. The buildings seemed taller. In the markets there was laughter again, tentative at first, then growing like a language long forgotten and newly relearned. It had been 8 months since the storm passed. No indictments, no sanctions, no foreign troops, and no apologies. Just a country left to itself at last. Burkina Faso had not merely survived the crisis. It had been reborn through it. And at the center of its revival stood a man who had refused to kneel not for power, but for the possibility that his people might one day stand on their own without asking permission. Ibrahim Traoré had made a promise during the chaos: "If we emerge from this, we will build something that no tribunal can dismantle." And now, brick by brick, seed by seed, that promise was becoming reality. The first reform came in education. Within weeks of stabilizing his administration, Traoré launched Project Sankharé, a national initiative named after the ancient West African Center of Learning in Timbuktu. The program redirected 25% of military spending into a civilian education trust funding, rural schools, technical institutes, and digital literacy hubs in all 13 regions of Burkina Faso. Solar-powered classrooms popped up where none had existed. Teachers were paid on time. For the first time, students in remote villages accessed online courses taught in both French and Moray. Traoré's message was simple: a nation that learns together cannot be colonized again. Next came agriculture, the soul of the land. Years of dependence on foreign food aid had hollowed Burkina Faso's independence. Traoré reversed that. Through local cooperatives and Pan-African seed exchanges, his administration launched Green Sahel, converting abandoned tracts of land into community farms, powered by irrigation tech from Sudan and solar energy from Guinean engineers. Burkina Faso, once a net importer of rice and millet, began exporting surplus to neighboring countries. Farmers once locked in subsistence were suddenly managers of supply chains. The third leg of Traoré's vision was technology, not the imported kind, but the kind made by Africans for Africans. With investment from East African fintech firms and North African universities, 3 Pan-African innovation labs opened in Bobo Dioulasso, Ouagadougou, and Kaya. These labs incubated young developers, renewable energy engineers, AI researchers, and agritech entrepreneurs. One group of students even built a drone prototype to track locust swarms before they reached farmland, a feat that earned praise in Nairobi and São Paulo alike. What stunned observers in the West wasn't the speed of progress. It was the absence of familiar names. No USAID, no IMF, no EU directives, no donor strings. The funding came from within Africa or from willing partners in Latin America and Southeast Asia, where the word aid had been long replaced with collaboration. Burkina Faso wasn't trying to shock the world. It was simply showing what could happen when a nation refused to be a client state. In Paris and Washington, analysts scrambled to explain the shift. Articles spoke of the Traoré model, though few could define it. Some predicted instability, others grudgingly praised its courage. But for the Burkinabe people, it was no longer about how others saw them. It was about how they saw themselves. And for the first time in generations, the mirror reflected not dependency, but dignity. The shift didn't happen all at once. There were no grand apologies from Western powers. No leaders stepped forward to admit missteps or manipulation. But slowly the tone changed from directives to dialogue, from conditional aid to cautious admiration. In Washington and Brussels, the old playbook had failed. The pressure campaign had not only unraveled, it had elevated Traoré, transforming him from a national leader into a symbol of continental sovereignty. And now if the West wanted a seat at Africa's table, it would have to ask for one. And Traoré, to the world's surprise, was willing to listen, but not on the old terms. From his newly rebuilt executive office in Ouagadougou, designed by local architects using traditional Sahelian materials, Traoré began initiating a series of mutual cooperation pacts, choosing his partners not by their GDP, but by their principles. Canada was first. Its ambassador arrived not with lectures, but with a proposal joint environmental research between Canadian universities and Burkinabe agro-engineers to study climate-resistant farming. No strings, no IMF conditions. Just shared research and reciprocal learning. Traoré approved the deal personally, calling it a treaty of mutual curiosity. Next came Chile and Uruguay, offering digital infrastructure cooperation and education exchange programs. Both countries had once suffered under foreign interference, and their governments recognized something familiar in Traoré's struggle. The partnerships were small in scale, but big in symbolism, South-South cooperation with a future-first philosophy. And then perhaps most unexpectedly came the mayors. From New York, Los Angeles, and Atlanta, a delegation of progressive U.S. city leaders requested a visit not on behalf of the federal government, but as municipal leaders representing multicultural coalitions. They met with Traoré in Ouagadougou, toured local innovation hubs, and co-signed an agreement to exchange urban farming technology, participatory budgeting tools, and youth leadership training. The soul of America doesn't always live in Washington, one mayor said during a joint press event. Sometimes it lives in the cities, the ones that know what it means to fight for dignity from the ground up. Traoré smiled at that. He understood it well. These partnerships weren't merely diplomatic. They were intentional acts of rewriting global relationships, no longer framed as donor-recipient or teacher-student, but as collaborators, each with wisdom to offer and lessons to learn. The African Union took notice. So did nations across the continent. Delegations from Ethiopia, Ghana, and Tanzania soon followed, not asking how Burkina Faso survived, but how it had begun to thrive. And in the halls of global institutions that once ignored it, Burkina Faso now had a voice. Not loud, not boastful, but clear, calm, and utterly unafraid. It was not the start of a new empire. It was the start of a new order, one built not on dominance, but on dignity. And this time, Africa was setting the terms. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of the new campus in Koudougou, where students in neatly pressed uniforms sat beneath neem trees laughing between classes. The school had opened just 2 weeks earlier. Its name etched in 3 languages on a bronze plaque at the front gate read, "Justice Reclaimed." The walls were built from sun-dried clay and solar bricks, combining tradition with technology. The classrooms hummed with the sound of multilingual learning, French moire, English, and code. A robotics club met in what used to be a millet storehouse. The library had a section called Banned Books from the Colonial Era, curated by students themselves. President Ibrahim Traoré walked slowly through the school grounds, hands behind his back, wearing a simple linen shirt and no visible security. Children ran past him, not in awe, but in ease. A small girl tugged his sleeve to show him the diagram she'd drawn of a wind-powered irrigation system. He knelt beside her, nodded thoughtfully, then whispered something that made her beam. A journalist from South Africa, trailing behind the president's team for a feature documentary, finally caught her moment. She stepped beside him as he approached the garden where students were learning hydroponics. "President Traoré," she asked gently, "do you hate America for what happened?" He paused but didn't flinch. Instead, he turned toward her with the kind of patience earned through storms survived. "No," he said. "I love justice." He let the words hang there for a moment. His gaze swept across the campus where the future was busy planting its roots. If America returns to justice, real justice, not the kind wrapped in conditions or wielded like a weapon, then I will embrace her too. Because that America is part of the dream that belongs to all of us. Not just to the powerful, but to the honest, the curious, the brave. The journalist lowered her mic slightly, not because the interview was over, but because she realized she had nothing left to ask. Behind them, the school bell rang, three soft tones, echoing through red clay walls and into the dry breeze. Traoré walked on, joining a group of teens under a mango tree, where they asked him about Mars exploration farming drones and how to get into a university in Accra. None of them asked about the ICC, or the Supreme Court, or Thomas, because their lives were no longer shaped by someone else's fear. They were shaped by their own future, and their future had a name: justice, reclaimed. Years later, the story of what happened between Ibrahim Traoré and Justice Clarence Thomas is no longer taught as scandal, but as a turning point. A historian speaking in a university lecture hall in Accra recounts it clearly. One young captain, armed not with weapons, but with principle, faced the most powerful judicial figure in the Western world, and he won not by defeating him, but by exposing him. Traoré's image now adorns murals across continents. In Bamako, he's painted beside Kwame Nkrumah and Thomas Sankara. In Brooklyn, a subway mural bears the words "Truth Outlives Titles." What began as a legal assault became a movement. The documents, the speech, the resignation, it's all history now. But living history, the kind that refuses to fade. In Burkina Faso, the story is no longer told through textbooks. It is passed down around fires in classrooms and over drums at youth festivals. The elders don't speak of dates or memos. They speak of values. He didn't fight with guns, one old griot tells a group of wide-eyed children beneath a baobab tree. He fought with dignity, and he won with truth. Children grow up hearing Traoré's story the way others hear fairy tales, except this one is real, and it belongs to them. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., echoes of his resistance linger. A grassroots movement of young Americans, inspired by the scandal, continues to demand reform. They campaign for transparency in judicial appointments, ethical boundaries for judges, and an end to legal influence from unaccountable organizations. They march with signs that read, "Justice should serve, not rule." Years after the crisis, Traoré returns to Washington, not as an enemy, but as a respected head of state on a goodwill visit. His convoy passes familiar monuments, but he asks for one private stop. At the foot of the Lincoln Memorial, under quiet drizzle, he steps alone toward the statue. He carries a single white flower. He lays it down gently, then stands in silence. Looking up at Lincoln's stone gaze, he whispers, "May all those in power remember they serve or they fall." And then he walks away, not as a soldier or a survivor, but as a man who reminded the world that justice, when reclaimed, belongs to everyone. Ibrahim Traoré, a young soldier from Burkina Faso, didn't need bullets or armies to stand against one of America's most powerful men. He used truth. In a world where legal systems are often twisted to serve the powerful, this story reminds us dignity, when paired with courage, can rewrite the rules. Clarence Thomas may have sat at the highest bench, but the real judgment came from the people, from voices who chose to listen, question, and stand with justice over status. It's easy to feel small in a world ruled by giants, but even the mightiest walls can crumble when faced with one person who refuses to kneel. What would it take for you to speak up calmly, boldly, when power goes too far? Let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear your perspective. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.